Well, Paul, thank you very much. Would I like wine or water? I ask you. I shouldn't really be here this evening, and perhaps by the end of my talk you will all agree with that statement. I had never had any intention of getting involved in politics at all. I used to be quite normal. You know, I had a job and I didn't have to work on Saturdays and Sundays, and I worked in financial markets. Commodity trading was what I did. And I had voted Conservative because I thought Mrs. Thatcher was really rather good and was really rather necessary for a Great Britain that in the 1970s seemed to be disappearing. But I'd never wanted to get involved in politics at all. And then one night, I was in the pub after a day's trading on the exchange, and a young lad ran in, this was in 1990, and he said, "Britain has just joined the exchange rate mechanism." Now, given that this is a Christian gathering, I won't tell you what my first utterances to that were, but suffice to say that I thought it was utterly moronic for the United Kingdom to peg sterling against the Deutschmark in an attempt to get us to join the single European currency. And I felt that because my experience in financial markets had shown me that whenever governments think they understand what the price of something is, or what it should be in the future, they have a 100% track record. They are wrong every single time. And we've seen this ever since Bretton Woods with currencies. We've tried snakes in tunnels, and we've tried fixed parities, and whether it's Argentina or whoever else it is, in the end these systems always fail. So I found it difficult to understand why we would be tying ourselves to the Deutschmark when it was so obvious to me that the British economy, that our patterns of trade across the world were such that after a period of time, be it 6 months or 6 years, we would go out of sync with the Deutschmark, causing grave interest rate problems for our country. Well, I didn't have to wait very long, and what amazed me about it was that it wasn't just the Conservative Party that supported it. No, the Labour Party supported it too, as did the Liberal Party. The entire political class in Britain said we must be part of the ERM. And I rapidly became an ERM bore, whether it was in the office or at the golf club, occasionally even engaging people on a train going home to Kent. I would tell people that this was going to be a disaster. And within 2 years, we had interest rates in Britain that were exactly double what they should have been. We had a year of record house repossessions, a year of record business bankruptcies, and an estimated 1 million people, quite unnecessarily, put on the unemployment register by the British government's desire to drag us ever closer to the European project. And it was at that moment that I thought, well, surely the arguments and the logic that apply to the euro actually apply to the whole European project. Because it seemed to me, even back then, that what we were doing was taking different countries with different cultures, different histories, different languages, and attempting to force them into one without ever asking those people whether they wanted this to be their future or not. So I got involved in politics in 1993. I got involved with UKIP when it was first founded, and we were much mocked and much derided. We were considered to be mad, bad, both of those. And the first election that I stood in, which was UKIP's first ever election, I managed just by a crushing 48 votes to beat screaming Lord Such, the leader of the official monster raving loony party of Great Britain. So that was where we started, with virtually no electoral support at all, but just a belief that our politicians were taking us in the wrong direction, and we've taken that on to the European elections of 2009, when I was very proud to lead UKIP into coming second across the entire United Kingdom, beating the Liberal Party and beating the governing Labour Party of the day. And you'll notice that it's not just in the United Kingdom that the opposition to this project is building. I thought what happened in Finland the other week was truly remarkable. I mean, Finland is a country with a very small c conservative culture. Those three parties have dominated Finnish politics forever. And suddenly, along comes the Millwall Football Club supporting larger-than-life, jovial Timo Soini, saying, look, you know, we've got rather good public finances in Finland. What are we doing? Bailing out, I think he called them Club Med countries, but I mean, okay, in politics one needs a little bit of license. Not, of course, that I'd ever be rude about anybody, you understand that. Unless, of course, he's just been appointed to be President of Europe, but we'll come back to that perhaps a bit later on, because he and I do not exactly see eye to eye. So we've seen this remarkable upsurge in support for the True Finns, and I understand that since the election, they are now leading in the opinion polls, because the Social Democrat Party said they would oppose further bailouts, but have now voted in Parliament the other way. We're seeing in Denmark, we're seeing in Austria, we're seeing in France, we're seeing right across the continent of Europe, we're seeing a new political phenomenon. And it's not right-wing and it's not left-wing. It's being supported by people who previously had been conservatives, who previously had been socialists. And really my argument to you tonight is that this European project is not working, but perhaps more seriously than that, that it has never had true and genuine consent, and that unless we find a genuinely democratic solution to this, then we're headed for very murky and very muddy waters indeed. The theory of Britain joining ERM, of course, was magnified at the end of the 1990s with the launch of the euro. Now, thank goodness, in Britain, we had a proper debate on this, and we didn't join it. It was the first victory, really, of ordinary people and business and small and medium-sized business voices against the political establishment. But everybody else rushed off, and they rushed into not just a common currency, but let's remember what we're talking about. It is a full economic and monetary union. That's what these countries signed up to, and there were those of us in the wings predicting from the start that it simply wouldn't work. Because as it was obvious to me that Britain and that sterling and the Deutschmark couldn't work together in parity, it was even more obvious, certainly to most economists that dared to think about the subject, that the idea that you could put Greece and Germany together in the same monetary union was something that simply wasn't ever going to work. But that didn't worry the people here in Brussels, it didn't worry the Commission, didn't worry the European Parliament, it didn't bother the entire political class, because they have a dream, don't they? They want to build a United States of Europe. In fact, as Elmar Brok once said to me, we had the misfortune to be put together in a taxi going back to the airport one day. And as I sat next to Elmar Brok, he bristled with indignation. He's rather good at that, Elmar Brok. And there was silence. And after a few minutes, he sort of shouted at me and he said, "You're ruining everything. You're ruining it." I said, "I'm not ruining anything." I said, "I've just been elected and sent here by some voters in Britain to represent a point of view." He said, "You don't understand. Britain, Germany, France, none of us are big enough on our own. Together, we can be the world's leading global superpower." And in a way, wasn't that rather good, refreshing honesty? Because generally at home, what politicians tell people is, look, nothing to worry about, it's just about cooperation, and here was Mr. Brok telling me that it was all about global domination. I must admit, I was a bit naughty when he said that, because I said, I wonder whether your grandfather said the same thing back in the 1930s. It was wrong of me, I know, but I couldn't resist it. So they powered ahead with this Euro project, not listening to economic advice, happy for countries to trim and to cheat, and the lunacy of countries like Ireland and countries like Spain joining the Euro meant, of course, that they had to halve their interest rates overnight. And what that has led to, certainly in Dublin, was the most incredible property explosion. There are now 300,000 empty or semi-built properties in Ireland, and in the case of Spain, something like 1.5 million empty or partially completed houses in Spain, all because they had inappropriate interest rates. Well, now we see countries like Greece that's been bailed out, Ireland that's been bailed out, Portugal that's been bailed out, and the Greeks, of course, are coming back for more. And it's a stunning thing to think that with the worsening public finances in Greece, their debt repayment to GDP ratio is now approaching 20%. it's completely unsustainable. It is actually totally impossible. Greece is bankrupt. And yet every time I have the opportunity to ask my helpful and positive questions, as I do of Mr. Barroso and Mr. Van Rompuy every month, I ask them, what is Plan B? What is Plan B? Have you prepared an alternative? Have you prepared an exit mechanism so that in the most orderly way possible, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and perhaps ultimately even Spain can go back to having their own national currencies? But no, there is no Plan B. They've got the blinkers on. They don't actually care how many tens of millions of people have to suffer. They don't actually care how many people lose their jobs. They're not interested. They're not interested. They intend to push on with this Euro project. Well, I'm sorry, but it's not working, is it? And we may well bail out Greece again. And we may well find Christine Lagarde is appointed to run the IMF. And I find it hard to believe that the Brazilians and the Indians and the Chinese are happy for the IMF to seemingly be there to bail out the euro, but there we are. But at some point in time, it's pretty obvious that some of those countries have to leave the eurozone. And I think that penny really is beginning to drop. And of course, the other great success, if you like, that the European Union had claimed for itself is that the object of this was not for it to be just a common market where we had the free movement of goods, capital and services. And those of us that are free marketeers, those of us voted for Margaret Thatcher, in theory, should be very much in favour of that sort of thing. Now, the difficulty with the European project, and what I think in the end is really going to bring it down, is that this was also to be about the free movement of peoples. Now, for a few years, it didn't really matter, because living standards in Britain, or France, or the Netherlands, or this non-country called Belgium that we're in at the moment, living standards were roughly equal. So about as many French people would come and work in London in the 1980s as British people would go to live, work or retire, perhaps in France. We barely noticed it. And actually 20 years into the Common Market project, the number of people leaving Britain and coming back to Britain and coming to work in Britain from other European countries, the number hadn't actually increased. It had made no real difference. But of course in 2004, all of that changed, because the European Union expanded its borders and we decided to let into the EU countries from the Baltic states and Eastern Europe that had living standards that were very much lower than ours. And I remember having this debate with the British Home Secretary at the time, who assured us that the opening up of the borders would lead to just a further 13,000 people coming into Britain every year. And in the first 2 years, something like 1 million people came. Now, even Milton Friedman, the high priest of free markets, of low regulation, even Milton Friedman said, you cannot have the free movement of peoples between rich and poor countries, all the while you've got a social security system. And part of the opposition that is building across this European Union, part of it, I think, is what would be characterised as being hard right-wing, because working people, unemployed people, across these European countries, and particularly young unemployed people. You know, the youth unemployment rate in Spain is, I think, 42%. In Italy, it's 25%. You know, there are millions and millions of young people out there who haven't got a job. And what they see is cheap foreign labour coming in from other European countries, undercutting in terms of price, in many cases being employed and being happy to be employed on the black market. And now, as of the 1st of May this year in Britain, anybody coming in from Poland or Lithuania is able to claim unemployment benefit on the first day they arrive. You know, is it surprising? Is it surprising that people say, look, we've worked for 25 years, we've worked for 30 years, we've paid into this system, but what on earth are we doing with our money, paying for people who've walked in from Poland the day before. Now, this is dangerous territory. This is very dangerous territory. I do not want to be involved in a political movement. I don't want to see the growth of political movements across Europe that are based on dislikes, based on racial hatred, or anything of the kind. But there is an irony here, isn't there? That the European project that was supposed to give us peace and make us all love each other and get rid of what it saw to be extreme nationalisms is actually in the very process of creating them. Now, I do understand, if there are people here from Greece or from Italy, I do understand that at the moment, in migration terms, you've got a problem. You know, it isn't just Lampedusa, is it? It's happening right across southern Europe. There are huge numbers of people seeking to come to Europe's shores. But what's actually happening is that there is now a fracturing between the north and the south. Just as with the euro, people in Finland, and I suspect in Germany and the Netherlands, are saying we can't go on subsidising countries that shouldn't be in the euro. We now have the southern European EU members crying out to Brussels and the northern members saying we've got this migratory flow and we want you to share the burden. And what the north is beginning to say quite loudly and quite clearly is it's your problem, and with unemployment where it is, we want no part of it. And I think that's why Denmark effectively tore up the Schengen Agreement the other day. So the EU is in a very, very deep economic crisis. It's got huge problems with the free movement of peoples. And I'm going to say, and this maybe won't surprise you, but I'm going to say that this European project, as a political union, actually deserves to die. And I'm pleased that it's doing badly. And let me explain. When, way back in the 1970s, when my parents were asked to vote in a referendum, they were asked to vote on whether we remain part of a common market. And the idea was there would be tariff-free trade with our European neighbours. The theory was that a domestic market of 55 million people would become a domestic market of 255 million people. We were assured by our government that this would not entail any loss of democracy or sovereignty whatsoever, because if there ever was a proposal that came out from Brussels that we didn't like, we would always have the right of veto. Now, you know, Britain's always played her role, whether it's the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, or sitting at the top table of NATO. I think Britain's a country that understands how international cooperation works, and I think my mum and dad thought this is another big cooperative project, and they voted for it. What they didn't vote for, and what I, age 47, have never been given the opportunity to vote on, is whether we want to be in a political union that now makes 75% of our laws, whose bosses we can't vote for, whose bosses we can't remove, to be part of a project that now costs us, just in terms of contributions, we pay a gross membership fee of £48 million a day, and to be members of an organisation that now prohibits us from choosing our own trade deals with the rest of the world. And I think the answer to all of this is both of my parents, if they had the opportunity to vote tomorrow on what they voted on back in 1975, would give a different answer. And there was a moment when they might have got this European project right. And it was with the launching of the Constitution. Giscard's great project, and they thought that they were going to mirror what those great men in America had done back in the 1780s, and they were going to produce this wonderful constitution for the European Union. And I know that many of the Christian groups indeed lobbied very hard to try and get it written in to the constitution that it was a Christian culture that existed within the EU. Of course, that didn't see light of day. But had the people behind this used the European Constitution as an opportunity to democratise the European Union, to be honest with the peoples of Europe about their intentions, to make the government of Europe come from within the elected European Parliament, if they'd done those things, they may well, through popular referendums, have carried the day. But if you remember, that isn't actually what happened, is it? That isn't what happened. They were determined, the leaders, not to give referendums, but in the end, one or two buckled. And of course Chirac buckled, and the French had a referendum. And the French said no. I remember the night, I was in Paris on the evening, and I thought, what strange bedfellows politics make, when I found myself, a former city trader, dancing in the fountains in Paris at 5:45 in the morning, arm in arm with the French Communist Party. I mean, there you are. But the French said no. 4 days later, the Dutch had a referendum on the European Constitution, and they overwhelmingly said no. Well, this meant the project was scuppered. But given the type of people we're dealing with, that didn't stop them. No, what they did is they rebranded it. They rebranded it as the Lisbon Treaty, not giving up a single power that had been in the previous constitution. And the former Italian Prime Minister D'Amato said the great thing about calling it a treaty is we now don't have to put it to referendums. You know, these are the type of people we're dealing with here. These are very, very dangerous people. Because one country did have a referendum, Ireland, and they of course said no. And they were then bullied mercilessly into voting yes the second time. To me, 2005 marked the point when this whole European project changed. You know, I admit I was deeply sceptical about the project prior to 2005. I am now very scared of this project. What is now behind this European Union is a new form of nationalism. It's Euro-nationalism. And we saw it the other week in Strasbourg as they goose-stepped the Euro flag around the yard, and everyone stood ramrod straight to attention when the European anthem played. I didn't. I held up a little Union Jack, you know, but about the best I could do, really. But it is Euro-nationalism. And please don't say that there's a democratic deficit in the European Union. Please don't say that the EU is undemocratic. It isn't. It's anti-democratic. They treated the voters of France, of the Netherlands, of Ireland with total contempt. They made sure that in countries like Britain, we didn't even get the opportunity to have our say. They don't care. And now the abuse they throw at us, the really dangerous word, the worst thing of all to be called, and that Paul very kindly introduced me with. Barroso did it 3 times the other day. And I remember the first time I heard it was from a German politician called Martin Schulz, who I'm not a great fan of. Poor chap, he can't keep his temper, old Schulze, and he gets terribly riled up, you know. And apparently, he is going to be the European Parliament president from this Christmas. So I've had 1 or 2 difficulties with the current chappie, Jerzy Buzek, who seems to fine me so often for things I say in the Parliament that perhaps I better give them a standing order. But we're going to finish up with Martin Schulz in a few months' time, which will be even worse, but rather more fun, I think, for me. And the day after the Irish had voted no, Schulz got up and he said, we must not bow to populism. And it's that word. It's that word. And now Mr. Barroso, who's never got the uptake with much, really, now Mr. Barroso has picked up on it. And 3 times in that last speech in Strasbourg, Barroso said, we must not bow to populism. So they are going to carry on, at least they think they're going to carry on, in their anti-democratic manner, ignoring the will of the people. Well, I've got news for them. We are on the up. We're fighting hard, and we believe in what we're fighting for. And I always say to audiences, you know, this idea that somehow UKIP or me, that we're anti-European, is absolutely ludicrous. You know, I married a German, I've worked for 2 French companies, admittedly both sacked me, but that's by the by, and I've drunk more Rioja than most people alive in Britain. I love Europe. I love Europe. It is the most fascinating and interesting and diverse and fascinating piece of landmass on this planet. But what we want, surely, all of us, is to live in a Europe where nation states trade together, cooperate together, Let's have reciprocal deals on workers, on students, on all of these things. But surely democracy matters. Goodness me, it was something that my grandparents' generation thought was so important that twice in the 20th century they were prepared to go and risk, and in some cases give, all they had to defend that very principle of democracy, to defend that very principle that we the people can elect our leaders, but more important than that, that once every 4 or 5 years we get the opportunity to turf the rascals out and to replace them with somebody else with a different manifesto. If you're unhappy right now in Greece with what's happening, what's left to you? No point voting for anybody, is there? Doesn't matter whether there's a conservative government in Greece or a socialist government in Greece. No, the European Central Bank and my old friend Mr. Van Rompuy, they're calling the shots. They're telling the Greeks what their tax rates have got to be. They're telling the Greeks how much they've got to borrow, how much they've got to spend. Democracy has been suspended in Greece. It's gone. And I put it to you that if you take away from people that powerful weapon of influencing their own future through the vote and through the ballot box, if you take that away from them, all they are left with is civil disobedience or civil disorder. And frankly, unless we get a proper democratic solution to this European problem, then the future that I see for our children and our grandchildren isn't just one of economic decline, but it's one, I'm afraid, of fractious violence taking place right across Europe as people fight to get their identities back. Please don't think this cannot happen. This historic mistake was already made in Europe in the 20th century. It happened in 1920, when the great leaders of the world said, what on earth are we going to do with all these warring Balkan countries? I have the solution. We'll give them one flag. We'll give them one anthem. We'll give them one police force, one army, one nation. We'll call it Yugoslavia, and it'll be peace in the Balkans forever. Well, we all know the appalling things that happened in the 1990s and into this decade, as many of those peoples fought to get their own identities back. It is right, it is the natural order of things that people want an identity and want to live together in nation states. The analysis from Jean Monnet onwards has been wrong. Of course, it's difficult for us to understand just the sheer devastation that was wrought upon France and Germany in those two hideous world wars. We can't even comprehend how people must have felt in 1945. And of course, it's understandable that people thought they'd try and find something better. But it's not the existence of nation states that cause wars. It's when there's a lack of democracy in nation states that we get wars. Mature, democratic nation states don't fight each other. That's the future that I want for Europe. I want Europe to be a big Council of Europe, where we sit round the table as nation states and agree to do things together. I'm perfectly happy for the United Kingdom and everybody else to play that role. But that is not what our friends up in the Berlaymont want. They are the masters, they have the power, they will do whatever they can to deny us. They're not going to deny us, but let's just cross our fingers and let's hope that it's moderate, successful political parties that force nation states into giving us a referendum so that we can decide our future and that the whole thing doesn't descend into mob violence. Thank you for listening. Any questions? Yeah.